Good evening, this is Brass Tacks. I'm Zakir Jacob. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is now over a month old. Both sides are trying to broker another round of peace talks. It's going to happen in Istanbul in Turkey. Now, this comes after US President Joe Biden over the weekend explicitly called for the overthrow of Vladimir Putin. No American president, not even in the height of the Cold War, has explicitly asked for a regime change in Moscow. This is now a comment that the White House has been scrambling to clarify. It also comes in a week when Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister and Putin's very close aide, is expected to be here in Delhi. If the visit indeed does happen, it'll be the highest level visit by a Russian official since the war began. Why does the West have a problem with India taking a neutral stand in this war between Ukraine and Russia? But first, let's get to the story that is emanating from Ukraine on day 33 of this war. Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine has entered its second month. Hundreds are dead, the scale of destruction is immense, and the humanitarian crisis is growing day by day.
The parking lot of this Ukrainian superstore has become an unofficial gateway for evacuees fleeing the combat zone. So you see cars that have made the dangerous journey with homemade signs here that say Дети, that means children, and the name of the city that is being battered by Russian forces, Mariupol there. Here you see a van that has the word evacuation written on the windshield here. And then you can also see that some people are tying little white flags and rags on their cars. These are all desperate attempts to try to protect civilians from coming under fire from the combatants that are arrayed in the nearby countryside.
Ukrainian President Zelensky says his country is prepared to discuss adopting a neutral status, but that he will not discuss any of the other Russian demands, including demilitarization of Ukraine.
Вообще не сядем за стол, если мы будем говорить о какой-то демилитаризации, какой-то денацификации. Для меня это непонятная абсолютная вещь.
US President Joe Biden, who flew down to Europe to reinforce the unity of the West against Russia, declared that Putin should no longer remain in power.
Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia. For free people refused to live in a world of hopelessness and darkness. We will have a different future, a brighter future, rooted in democracy and principles, hope and light, of decency and dignity, of freedom and possibilities. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
Just before Biden's speech in Poland, an airstrike struck a fuel depot just outside Lviv in western Ukraine, close to where Biden was.
You see through there, you can see some of the firefighters on the scene there, right to the right of this building, just to the corner of that building. You can see some of the firefighters on the scene, and they're putting the fire retardant on there. No water on this situation, not on a chemical fire. They're not using water on that.
The Russia-Ukraine war is in its fifth week now. That is much longer than what Vladimir Putin would have anticipated. But the longer this war goes on, the greater the risk of an alienated Putin doing something dramatic like pressing the nuclear button. Now, the exact aim of Russia's invasion is not clear. It was initially aimed at swiftly capturing major cities and toppling the government. Denazification is the word that Vladimir Putin used. Russian troops first tried to encircle the capital Kiev, but after the bombardment and the seizing of several towns to the northwest, they were forced back by Ukraine's military. In fact, Ukrainian forces have been trying to regain territory from the Russians, so now Russia says it's going to focus on liberating the east, the Donbass, signaling a possible shift in military strategy. Let's just take a look at some of the cities that Russia has managed to capture and what the exact game plan is. If you were to take a look at the map of Ukraine, all the way from Cherniv in the northeast across the entire major belt in the eastern side of Ukraine, from Kharkiv, which is the second biggest city, to Luhansk and Donetsk, the capitals of the two big provinces in Donbass, Mariupol, which is a southern port city, which has direct link to the Black Sea, and then all the way to Odessa and Kherson. It's very clear what Vladimir Putin and the Russian troops are trying to do is to create a semicircle almost, the entire eastern belt of Ukraine being completely cut off, as a result of which they want to create a buffer state, almost like North and South Korea, or what used to be erstwhile East and West Germany. They want to create a buffer state between Ukraine and Russia, as a result of which Russia's security interests are not directly threatened by a Ukraine, which Russia feels is moving closer and closer to NATO. So that's the game plan by Vladimir Putin's troops. And over the weekend, they have said there's going to be a recalibration. Take a look at this entire set, the Ukrainian fight back that's happening in Kiev. Certainly, for the last few weeks now, we've heard the story of a convoy being stuck, or multiple convoys being stuck on the outskirts. Kharkiv is the second biggest city. At one point, it had almost fallen to the Russian forces, but now Ukrainian troops are pushing back. Same's the case in the southern city of Mykolaiv, as well as in the west in Makariv. So there is major fight back of the Ukrainian forces, and that includes in the suburb of Irpin. We're getting breaking news from there. This is in the northwestern side of Kiev, the capital. From Irpin, and Irpin has seen some deadly clashes over the last few weeks. There appears to have been a now completely taken back by Ukrainian forces. The mayor of Irpin has confirmed this is one of the major hotspots. The mayor there has confirmed that Ukrainian troops have now captured the city again. Now it is in control of Ukrainian troops. Let me go across to Salma Abdulaziz, who's joining us from Lviv in Ukraine. It is in the far west. This pattern that we're seeing of Ukrainian troops trying to regain cities that had supposedly almost entirely fallen in Russian control. What is going on the ground? Because we're also getting word from Ukrainian intelligence, which seems to suggest that the game plan now, and the Russians have recalibrated their game plan, they want to try and create an eastern buffer state, almost like your North and South Korea or the erstwhile East and West Germany, which will kind of act as a buffer state against Russia and creeping NATO interests as Russia sees it.
Right. So if you do, as you've pointed out, look at the map, the goal is to create that buffer zone. But it's not just about creating a buffer zone. It's also about creating a land corridor that would connect Russian territory all the way down through the east, all the way down the eastern flank to Crimea, which is a warm water port. It would be Russia's only port that would function year round. And that's very significant for trade, of course, and for its ability to maneuver logistics supplies. And, of course, then you have the Russian-speaking areas, the so-called two republics in the Donbass, the separatist areas that Russia also wants to take. So it connects these three major locations, the Russian border, the separatist areas, all the way down to Crimea, giving Russia access to a warm water port, making it able to expand its trade and its capabilities abroad. But let's look at what's actually happening on the battlefield. Russia has yet to really gain control of any major city. It has yet to make any major gains on the ground. Instead, actually, what we're hearing from U.S. officials is that there's been major miscalculations, that thousands of Russian troops, up to 15,000 Russian troops, may have already died on the battlefield, that they're having trouble with supplies, that they're losing precision weapons, that they've been unable to take control of the skies. And this is significant when you're looking at the fact that Russia is a military superpower and Ukraine is supposed to be much smaller, much less equipped, much less funded than, of course, the Russian military. But at the same time, Ukraine has, of course, been bolstered by its allies. It's been given Turkish drones. It's been given anti-tank systems by Western friends. It's been given thousands of missiles by the United States. And they're going to continue to feed and fund that counteroffensive that Ukrainian officials tell us has been successful in gaining back some ground, in clawing back some territory. But again, these gains are not solidified. So what you're looking at more and more here is a war of attrition, where the fault lines, if you will, may shift and move a little bit, but not significantly. But caught in the middle of that, of course, are civilians. So you hear this word stalemate thrown around sometimes, but this is not a stalemate in the sense that bombs, bullets, artillery will keep flying with families caught between them.
All right, Salma Abdulaziz, for the moment, thanks very much for joining us from Lviv. in western Ukraine. Meanwhile, shifting focus to India, where Prime Minister Modi has had several phone calls, both with Russian President Vladimir Putin as well as Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. But for the first time since this war began, one of Mr. Putin's closest aides and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov will be in Delhi this week. Now, Lavrov's visit comes just months after Mr. Putin himself was here back in December for the annual summit. But the circumstances are very, very different now as the US and European allies increase pressure to try and isolate Russia. Sending his top minister is being seen as a move by Putin to reach out to India, but it could also mean that he's looking at Delhi as a mediator in this war. It will not be the first time, though. Remember, Turkey has chosen not to apply Western sanctions imposed on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. At the start of this war, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he condemned Russia's actions, but later he toned down on the rhetoric. Turkey, remember, is a full-fledged member of NATO, but it also buys Russian weapons, and now it's hosting both Ukraine as well as Russia. Turkey is struggling to revive its economy. It needs peace to be given a chance, which is why Erdogan, much like others, is also sitting on the fence and trying to be an impartial mediator. Remember, the talks are going to happen in Istanbul. Meanwhile, it's not just Turkey. There's also Israel, in particular, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who's been in power just for a few months, but he's had a surprise visit to Moscow earlier this month. He's already assuming the role of an unlikely mediator. He's the only Western leader to have met Putin during this month-long war. Now, Israel is one of the few countries that has a good working relationship both with Kiev as well as with Moscow. But Israel's ties with Russia are of greater strategic importance. Remember, Israel relies heavily on Russia for security coordination, intelligence coordination in the ongoing war that's happening in Syria. Russia is also among the powers that are negotiating with Iran over its nuclear program. Israel feels the world is letting Iran get away lightly, and Russia is helping prevent that. Which is why, even though Naftali Bennett has reportedly expressed support for the people of Ukraine, and let's not forget, Vladimir Zelensky is a Jew. Ukraine is home to more than 200,000 Jews. That is not a fact that's lost on Israel. Yet at the same time, the Prime Minister of Israel has stopped short of condemning Russia's invasion.
As for the war in Ukraine, Israel stands firm with the people of Ukraine and is going to continue our effort to help reduce the suffering and end the bloodshed. I'm proud of what Israel is doing. And of course, we're doing what we can when asked to contribute to the efforts to end this war. We do this while maintaining close coordination with the United States and with our European partners.
Which brings us back to the question of India's role in this conflict. So far, India's stand has been neutral. There's no outright condemnation of Russia's invasion and no clear support either. India abstained from voting against Russia at least 5 times at the United Nations, both in the Security Council and in the General Assembly. But New Delhi has also not voted, abstained in fact, from 2 motions that were moved by Russia. So clearly saying that it's not backing Russia either in this war. Unlike its Western allies, India is also gearing up to purchase more Russian oil at a discounted price, one of the prime reasons why Lavrov is going to be here this week. Also remember, India hosts the G20 summit next year, and India is unlikely to support any move of ousting Russia from the group of 20 nations. Through its actions and its statements, India is also making it clear that NATO and Russia can resolve this issue through dialogue. But New Delhi's neutrality can also be viewed as a tilt towards Russia. Is there merit in that assumption? After all, India and Russia are quote-unquote brothers in arms. Nearly 86%, think about that for a second, 86% of India's weapons are of Russian origin. India has placed orders for several batteries of the S-400 missile defense system, said to be one of the best in the world. It's also in talks now for further purchase of the S-500 Prometheus systems as well. There are also collaborations with Russia to manufacture nuclear submarines and also fighter aircraft. Much of India's air fleet, fighter jet air fleet, is Russian-made. And to put things in perspective, between the year 2000 and 2020, that is in the last 20 years, Russia accounted for 2/3 of all of India's arms imports. At the same time, remember, India is a critical member of the Quad and the only nation which can counter China in the Asia-Pacific. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has created a distinct difference of opinion within the Quad. The United States has slapped Russia with sanctions. So have other Quad partners, Australia and Japan. But at the same time, those two countries have accepted India's neutral approach. Not quite US President Joe Biden, who's been openly critical, calling New Delhi's position somewhat shaky.
In response to his aggression, there has been, we presented a united front throughout NATO and in the Pacific. The Quad is, with the possible exception of India being somewhat shaky on some of this, but Japan has been extremely strong, so has Australia, in terms of dealing with Putin's aggression.
All right, let me go across to our guest now. Ksenia Kondratieva is a senior Russian journalist joining us live from Moscow. We'll be joined by Sviatoslav Yurash. He's a Ukrainian member of parliament. Lieutenant General P.S. Jaswal, retired defense expert, former commander of the Northern Command, is joining us. Vishnu Prakash, former diplomat, is joining us. And Raymond Vickery, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce. Let me start with Ksenia Kondratieva. Is it fair to say, and over the weekend we got word from the Russian side that there's going to be a recalibration of Russia's military operations, that phase one of the military operations are over, and now it'll be mostly focused on liberating the eastern part. And as I explained at the top of the show, the entire east, from Sumy and Cherniv in the northeast, through Kharkiv and all the way to Mariupol and Odessa in the southeast, is the aim of the Russian invasion now to carve out a separate eastern Ukraine which could act as a buffer state?
Thanks for having me and for the question. Yes, that's what we have heard from the Ministry of Defense officials. While they are still not really officially saying what the plan is, we can just do some guessings. But yes, these are areas that are of strategic importance, and Russian army have well advanced there. You see the Mariupol, I think, at least as well as the commanders are saying 2-3 days, and it will be also liberated. So these are very strategically important areas, and also, well, it can be questionable, but these are the areas where Russia's presence is, let me put it mildly, less questioned by the native population as compared to the other parts of Ukraine. But of course, we will see both reactions.
But when people, Vladimir Putin launched this invasion back in February 24th, he said regime change, he said denazification. Is the fact that 33 days on, the fact that none of the big cities in Ukraine have fallen, and now there is a recalibration, establishing or trying to establish an eastern Ukraine as some kind of a buffer state, is that an admission that the initial aim was perhaps too much or too ambitious even for the Russian army to try and get? That is regime change, ousting Vladimir Zelensky out of power, and denazification of Ukraine.
I think it's very important to clarify a few things here. As you just mentioned, and as your correspondent previously mentioned, see, this is a Western narrative of how things are happening or what Kremlin's plan was. Because if you see, Russia has never stated anything about a quick war, a quick win, a blitzkrieg. It was initially a Western narrative, started somewhere in November or December, because I was tracking those things, for my own stories. Mm-hmm. Russia has never said that it wants to finish the war in 2 days. I don't know from where the Western media have picked it up. It has picked it up from some of the Western military experts who said in November, I wouldn't remember the name right now, but the expert said that Russian military can destroy, Ukraine in 30, 40 minutes, something like that. And then this has been quoted by Russian media as well. And the whole narrative was built up.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to go across to Sviatoslav Yurash. He's a Ukrainian member of parliament. Over the weekend, we've had US President Joe Biden in Poland calling for a regime change. No American president, not even at the height of the Cold War, has openly asked for a regime change. Is it becoming more and more clear, not just in the help that NATO has extended, whether it is not, forcibly shutting down the airspace, not putting boots on the ground, and now this statement perhaps will only further, anger Vladimir Putin, that ultimately, if the objective is to put an end to this war, then the US or NATO are not exactly helping that cause by crying out loud from the rooftops that Putin needs to be overthrown. Mr. Urash.
The reality is Putin has done too much to deserve being thrown out of the throne. He hasn't just meddled in Ukraine, he's meddled all around the world with one simple goal: to destroy national world order. And as far as Mr. Putin is concerned, he has done crimes unimaginable. And for that, he deserves far more than just being thrown out of power. He deserves to be in international courts, to be tried as those perpetrators of the heinous crimes of Second World War had been. So as far as the call for the Putin's end of his leadership of Russia, that's long overdue, and that's the least you can say about that man. So,
but Mr. Urash, if the immediate objective is to end this war, then that has to be a negotiated settlement between Ukraine and Russia, between the presidents of Ukraine and Russia, and clearly by saying we want Mr. Putin out, we want to overthrow Mr. Putin. Are you sure, are we looking at an immediate cessation of hostilities? That's not encouraging putting an end to this war.
The reality is that if you are ending this war at all costs and you fulfill all the Mr. Putin wants, you invite aggression, not just in the region, but all around the world. You tell despots that if they apply aggressive stance and wage aggressive wars, they can get what they want. And that opens the door to many conflicts to happen around the world. And the fact of the matter is that Mr. Putin's behavior shouldn't be entertained with negotiations and fulfilling what he wants, but should be treated as an act of aggression against the world and should be responded accordingly.
Let me ask Raymond Vickery, at Victory. Even through the entire Cold War period, end of the Second World War, all through to 91, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Mr. Vickery, no American president openly called for regime change. And even in the last few months, even before this war began, everyone from Antony Blinken downwards was going out of their way to say that regime change is not something that the United States is looking at right now in Russia. And yet, what prompted the US president to say that at the end of his speech in Poland?
Well, I think that what prompted it was the continuing slaughter which is going on in Ukraine. A slaughter which, by any measure, is a violation of international law and all of those principles that the United States and India and other democracies hold dear. I think that since the president's remarks, there have been some attempts to clarify that what we're not trying to do is to go in for regime change. And yet, for Vladimir Putin to have taken this extraordinary measure, which strikes at the very heart of the values which India, the United States, other democracies hold dear, it is a situation in which that just cannot be ignored.
No, I agree with you on that, Mr. Vickery. I completely agree with you on that. My question, though, is the immediate priority to put an end to this war? And if it is, then how does that statement help?
Well, the immediate priority is to do two things. One, to end the war, and two, to preserve democracy and human rights in Ukraine. The war could be ended tomorrow by Ukrainians simply saying, we give up, we're going back in the Russian Empire as we were before, and it's over. And then, of course, the Russians would round up Zelensky's and others and execute them or throw them into some sort of prison in Siberia, and it would be over. So you have a tension between the goals here.
But that's not quite what is happening on the ground, and thanks in no small measure to the bravery shown by the Ukrainian people. But ultimately, I'm very clear about this. There has to be a negotiated settlement, a negotiated end to this war, and any country should put that as the top priority. But I want to come to the India angle, and I want to bring in General Jaiswal as well as Vishnu Prakash into this conversation. Vishnu Prakash, I'll start with you. Sergei Lavrov is going to be here in India this week. Ostensibly, it is also to try and say thanks to India for taking a neutral stand. While that may be the case, how long more can India go on with taking these abstentions? Even just over the last few days, there were more abstentions that happened. It's abstaining, not just motions being moved by Western countries, but also a couple of motions moved by Russia too. India has abstained from voting. Is it just immediate interest, whether it is securing Russian gas or ensuring that Russia's Russian defense supply chains are kept intact? Is that for expedient reasons why we are continuing to abstain? And more importantly, how long can we continue to abstain?
Zaka, good evening. I will very respectfully differ when you talk of neutrality. I still believe that India is not neutral. We have a lot of skin in the game. We have taken a stance which serves India's interest, but we are not tilting towards Russia. In fact, if we see the wording of what India has been saying, international law should be respected, territorial integrity should be respected, sovereignty should be respected, human rights of Ukrainians should be respected. Except for saying that what Russia has done is invasion, we have said it all. So I don't think that we are neutral.
But what about the action, Ambassador? The action ultimately is abstention. I think, like I counted at the top of the show, 5 abstentions.
Yes, there is abstention. There is abstention, but it is a principled abstention. We cannot condone aggression for reasons that we all know. So I don't think that it is a neutrality. And also, India's position has evolved and may evolve further. Having said that, the visit of Lavrov is quite significant. I think he would be seeking India's continued support. Rather, he would solicit India's support even further. I think he would remind India or allude to the support that Russia has traditionally given India. He would perhaps also remind India or talk about the spare parts, etc., that Russia had rushed to India when Raksha Mantriji had gone in June 2020, etc., etc. So I think it is more to garner the support of India than anything else. For commercial reasons, I don't see Lavrov coming to India.
Okay, let me also ask General Jaiswal. One thing this war has shown is India's over-dependence on Russia when it comes to defense supplies as well as spare parts. Even today, 2/3 of both imports as well as spare parts come from Russia. For 2 reasons, shouldn't we start looking at diversification? One, this over-dependence, and B, given this war, Russian defense supplies itself, a large number of it would have been either expended in this war, or their priority would now be for their own defenses rather than supplying to third countries like India. So where does India go as far as its defense dependence is concerned on Russia?
Good evening, Zaka and my fellow panelists. You're right. We have over-dependence on Russia for our defense equipment. But there is a paradigm shift in the philosophy of production of defense equipment in India, and that's the reason this Atmanirbhar, hats off to our Prime Minister, what he has said, and he started off innovation, incubation and entrepreneurship. We want to produce in India, but it cannot be a quick fix. It takes time. We are trying to produce equipment out here, but majority of the parts are still coming from Russia. But what we have seen, Russia has been a very, very reliable partner as far as supply of equipment is concerned. So I'm sure whatever equipment is left with him is more than sufficient to face any threat, because large-scale threat I do not envisage Russia is going to face. So Russia will be able to keep the conduit of supply open to us. Philosophy has to change for self-reliance and self-sufficiency. I think that is the buzzword of the future, and the government has given impetus to the same. So we should be able to produce the best of equipment, and of course we will initially import some key equipment, key instruments which are there from Russia or whosoever it is. But we cannot forget that Russia has been a very, very reliable partner to us, and we can trust him to meet our requirement in the near future.
Let me go back to Ksenia Kondratyeва, because I'm told that one of the critical reasons why Sergei Lavrov is going to be here in India this week is for furthering the rupee-ruble agreement to settle oil purchases, etc., and other purchases in the local currencies, be it rupee or be it ruble. Is it all? And I think a similar request was put up, or a similar demand was put up by the Russian side to their European purchasers as well of oil. Many of those countries have rejected that. Ultimately, is Russia also appending, whether advertently or inadvertently through this war, is it also changing the whole business of production and buying of oil, which until now, Ksenia Kondratyeва, has been done in US dollars for the last 50, 60 years? Is that whole system now being threatened because of Russia's war?
Well, the existing system and the reliance of payments for any commodities on dollars have been threatened by US sanctions and European sanctions, and not by the war itself, right? So I would like to point out that the request for partners to pay for Russian gas in rubles was made to those countries that Russia, labels as unfriendly, those countries that have placed sanctions on it. India is not on the list. But why it's difficult for India to pay for the commodities in dollars, because you have to see how the bank transactions work. And since 2014, since the first sanctions were placed, we know that Indian banks have had some difficulties in transferring those payments, because they have large exposure to dollar, to deal with US, to trade with US. And they were often very afraid of processing any payments, even payments for the diplomatic missions in India, because of those sanctions and because of that fear.
Okay.
So I think it's very significant. I don't know how much, as the previous panelists say, whether Mr. Lavrov is there to really do those talks, because we would expect, the rupee-ruble trade talks to be done by other people, but probably since, the visit is happening, they will discuss this as well, because right now, with all the US and European sanctions placed on Russia on its reserve that have been frozen, it's a very significant issue, not just for Russia, but for India as well.
Vickery, do you reckon that this is going to be a broader trend? Already we are seeing China and Russia trade oil in their respective local currencies. We're given to understand that rupee-ruble will be a big talking point when Sergei Lavrov comes here this week. Russia is now going to be selling to any country that is willing to settle it in its own currency, and thereby reducing the dependence on the US dollar. Raymond Vickery.
Definitely, that will be the only and the preferred
I think
way
that
trade.
India needs to look at where its interests lie commercially. And it doesn't lie, the interest of India economically and commercially do not lie with Russia. There has been this emphasis on oil. India, in fact, has received very little, less than 8% of its oil traditionally from Russia. It gets it from the Middle East, gets it from the U.S., gets it from other places in Africa. So this is not a crucial matter for India. India just trying to take advantage of some cheap oil prices and not looking at the bigger picture, to me, is very short-sighted. Mm-hmm. One of the ways that India ought to look at the economic situation is how much trade and investment it does with the United States and Europe versus what it does with Russia. The trade is less than 10%, and the investment is even less than that. It's plain that India's interests long-term, economically, whether it be calibrated in terms of oil or any other commodity, is with the rest of the world and not with Russia.
Okay, I want to ask Ambassador Prakash that, I mean, leave aside, the trade and economic aspect of it, even on something like Quad, where there is a great convergence of interest between the four countries, there's a very clear purpose for why those countries have come together. Now we have seen a difference crop up in 3 out of those 4 countries responding to the Russia-Ukraine situation in one way, and India responding differently. And yes, Australia and Japan have appreciated India's support and the fact that India is not expected to take, similar or identical stands on all issues concerned. Yet at the same time, US President has called India somewhat shaky. The question is, at a long-term level, is this now threatening India's some of India's other core interests as well, like, for example, this difference that's cropped up in the Quad? Ambassador Prakash?
Zaka, with due respect to my American colleague, let me say that every country looks after its own interests. And I think India is very well qualified to decide what is good for India, what is not good for India. I don't want to be polemical, but why can India not buy oil from Russia? And if that is the case, why is it that Nord Stream 1 pipeline is still operational? Why is it that oil is still flowing through Ukraine? So, I mean, let's not talk about what is right, what is wrong. It is national interest. Now, as far as Quad is concerned, what has to be appreciated is that we are not allies of the US. We do not have a defense pact. Mm-hmm. Australia and Japan are allies, so the relationship is different. We are a global and strategic partner. Secondly, it would seem, or there is a possibility that now American interest or focus will shift to Europe more. So there's a question mark about the continued American interest or focus on the Indo-Pacific region. Yeah. So there are issues, but in no relationship can you have 100% convergence of interests. Okay. We are in a different geography. We have our own concerns. The US has its own. I think we should respect each other's concerns instead of pointing fingers.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm getting a piece of breaking news. I want to thank our guests as well, but this one is important in the context of the Ukraine-Russia war and the negotiations. We're getting this piece of breaking news coming in from Istanbul, where a plane carrying members of the Russian delegation has landed in Istanbul. This is ahead of talks with Ukrainian negotiators. Remember, those talks begin tomorrow. Turkey's private news agency Aide is reporting that round 6 of the Ukraine-Russia talks are expected to begin sometime post-noon tomorrow. So it's going to be a very, very significant round of talks. Remember, Turkey has been trying to play the role of a mediator. So is Israel. And this is going to be the second round of talks that we're seeing in Turkey since this war began. Will we see definitive forward movement tomorrow when these talks happen? Yes, Zelensky has said he's willing to commit to Ukraine's neutrality in return for security guarantees. Will that be acceptable to the Russian side? And ultimately, will there be a cessation of hostilities? Will there be a face-saver of an exit, if you will, for Russia and for Russian President Vladimir Putin to finally put an end to this 33-day war that we have seen, where numerous, not just combatants have died, but also innocent civilians, men, women, and children have died. So round 6 of those talks between Ukraine and Russia slated to begin in Istanbul. The Russian delegation has arrived there. We're given to understand the Ukrainian delegation too is en route to Istanbul, and they will be there soon in the next few hours. We'll keep an eye out on that story and more. What we'll do now is to take a quick break here on the program. When we come back, we'll shift focus from Russia, Ukraine to what's happening domestically. There was a massive showdown in the Bengal Assembly today between TMC and BJP MLAs. Eventually, the Speaker suspending as many as 5 BJP MLAs, including the leader of the opposition, Shuvendu Adhikari. We'll take a quick break. We'll see you on the other side for that face-off.